Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's message. I'm Eric, the lead pastor of South Mountain Community Church. Thank you for taking just a bit of your time to be with us today. We exist for one reason, and that's to help as many people as possible take their next step towards becoming fully devoted and fully delighted followers of Jesus Christ. And I know that for so many people, church and even religion can be messy and oh so complicated, but it doesn't have to be that way. Here you can belong before you believe. So our hope is that your first visit with us is enjoyable, meaningful, and unlike the church experiences of your past. We also think that the best way to experience delight is with others in person. So SMCC is about more than just a Sunday sermon. We have 5 locations for you to choose from where you can connect with people in authentic community. We want every message you hear to engage your head, your heart, and your hands for a life of full delight. So with all of that in mind, enjoy today's message.
Well, if we haven't met, I'm Eric, and get to serve as one of the pastors here at SMCC, and I'm really glad that you'd be here with us on this week rolling in to Thanksgiving. You're here in the first service on a rainy day. Well done. Now, I want to start off today by just sharing with you the theme, the topic of our morning. Today I want to talk with you about redemption. And I don't mean the bar over in Harriman. I know what some of you are thinking. I've seen some of you there, actually. I've been there. I actually officiated a wedding there a while back with a bunch of SMCCers. It was a whole lot of fun, but not that type of redemption. I want to talk about this theme that shows up throughout our lives constantly. Whenever we have these feelings of not being enough or not being worthy or not being good enough or unlovable, those are all feelings that connect to our need or our connection to redemption. And I've noticed there's this phrase that's on repeat in my mind, and perhaps it's a phrase that showed up in your life as well. It's a phrase that reminds us of our need for redemption. And the phrase is this: I'm too blank to blank. I'm too blank to blank. And I've filled it in many ways throughout my life. Perhaps you've filled it in. Here are some common ways to fill this in. I'm too awkward to belong to community. I'm too broken to belong to a church. I'm too guilt-ridden from my past to be joy-filled in my present. I'm too insecure to be a leader. I'm too blank to blank. We could go on and on with ways to fill that in. You've surely filled it in many ways throughout your life. On the other side of the coin, it could sound like this: I'm too strong to ask for help. I'm too successful and impressive to serve. I'm too capable to show my weakness. We could go on and on. And in moments like that, I'm too blank to blank, we are reminded of our need for redemption. Here's how I like to think of it. We all need a redeemer. To make it personal, we all need a redeemer, someone who can step into our lives and tell us what's true about us, help us assess our lives, our worth, and our value in the correct way. So we all need a redeemer. Now, this word redemption or redeemer, it's an important word. I want to take you into it at a bit of a deeper level. The definition actually has marketplace or economical meaning. It was used in business. It was used in transaction. Growing up as a kid, I collected cans because I wanted to make some money. So I'd go around with one of those big bags and connect cans. And on the can, you would see what it was redeemable for. Yeah, this thing could be traded in for this thing in return. This thing was worth this much to someone else, and it would be redeemed. They would give you something, and they would get the can in return. So redemption has economic or marketplace realities. Here's one way to think about a definition of redemption. I'll pay because you can't. I'll pay because you can't. I'll pay because you just never could. This is at the heart of this idea of redemption. And so we're learning this by studying a very famous Old Testament book, the Old Testament book of Ruth. We've been studying it for 2 weeks. This is week 3. Next week will be week 4, and we will wrap up our study in the Old Testament book of Ruth. And if you haven't been here with us, I'll get you caught up to speed over time here. But basically, it's the story of a man and a woman, Ruth and a man named Boaz. It's a bit of a rags to riches story, but it's far from a Disney fairy tale. It's the redemption of one family in history that would set up the redemption of millions throughout history. Now, the book is 4 chapters long, 83 verses in total, and the word redemption or redeem comes up 23 separate times. Let that be an indicator to us of what this book is actually about. And the book opens really with this woman named Naomi. She's married to Elimelech. They're in Judah, and there is a famine. Elimelech has passed away, so Naomi takes her two sons, I'll try to pronounce them correctly, Mahlon and Chilion. If you're looking for names for your kids, go with those two. Pretty good. All right, really fits the Utah vibe. All right, spell it very uniquely. And they head off to the land of Moab, not with the arches, a wonderful place to vacation in Utah, but this foreign, distant land from Judah. And there, Mahlon and Chilion marry two gals, Ruth and Orpah, not Oprah, Orpah, okay? And then, unfortunately, those sons die. And so we've seen struggle, we've seen heartache, we've seen some turmoil, and eventually they're going to return back to their land after about 10 years, okay? Now, to press in a little bit to who Ruth was, a bit of a character study into her life, we could talk about her in the way we introduce today's message. I'm too blank to blank. This really does begin to describe Ruth's life. Take a look. Ruth was too dirty to belong in Israel. She was a Moabite. Moabites are descendants of Sodom. If you've heard the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, you know how broken and rough and vile that place was. She was a foreigner in Israel. They saw her as too dirty to belong. Ruth was too broken to be loved. By this point, she's a widow. We've learned that from Ruth chapter 1 and Ruth chapter 2. And at that point, as a widow, she's been grieving, she's been distraught, and yet we see her character on display. But to everyone around her, she was too broken to be loved. She was too impoverished to be valued. She quite literally had nothing. And then, of course, for her mother-in-law, Naomi, it was very similar. She was too old to work, too old to marry, and too old to have children. She had no value. And yet all of this, I'm too blank to blank, really is the prerequisite to this idea of redemption. They needed someone who could cover what they couldn't, who could pay for what they could never pay for. And really, when it comes to redemption, there's this question that I think Naomi was wrestling with and Ruth would have been wrestling with. It's a question that we've perhaps wrestled with in our own lives. Am I worth anything to anyone? Am I worth anything to anyone? Because I would love to have somebody who could share with me what I'm worth, show me my value. Am I worth anything to anyone? And it's in those moments that we will either try to redeem ourselves by performing our way into our worth and value, or we will turn to somebody who will justify and redeem our lives. So all of this brings us to Ruth chapter 3. But before we get there, you need to know this. Ruth has now met a man named Boaz. We learned all about this last week, okay? Ruth has met Boaz. They've exchanged some incredible kindness, service, protection, and support. But now about 8 weeks has gone by, sort of 2 different harvest cycles, and Boaz has ghosted Ruth, okay? I don't know, ladies, is 8 weeks, that's not a good sign, is it? It's just not a good sign. Men in the room, why do men do this? I'm not so sure. But anyways, it's been about 8 weeks, and that's where we pick it up today in Ruth chapter 3. They're kind of wondering, is this redemption thing going to happen? Am I worth anything to anyone, specifically Boaz? So with all of the backstory now, let's pick it up in Ruth chapter 3. We're going to read through and study each verse of Ruth chapter 3 today to cover the whole chapter. Picking it up in verse 1. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." We'll just pause right there. They really have nothing, but Naomi knows of an Old Testament provision, the provision of a levirate marriage or a kinsman redeemer. Let me process this with you for just a moment. Levirate marriage doesn't come from the word Levi. Levirate in English comes from a Latin word, lever, which means a husband's brother. That's what lever means. So a levirate marriage was one with a husband's brother. And in ancient culture, when a husband passed away with no descendants, there was a very common practice where the wife, the widow, would then marry her husband's brother, the lever, and the first son from that marriage would be the descendant of the deceased husband. And in this way, that family, that lineage could continue through that son. And in this way, the land could continue, that family could be supported, and they could actually thrive. So it was a legal union with the descendant of the dead husband. It was called a kinsman redeemer. In Hebrew, the word is goel, a goel, the one who could cover for you when you could never cover for yourself. God did not want his people to experience the fracture and the pain that comes from these divides between the rich and the poor in Israel. So there was provision and there was a way for people to be provided for. Naomi knows about that. She's trying to set that up. Verse 2. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, he's a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, get dressed in your best clothes. You're going out, It's that type of situation. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. And when he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He'll tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So they really do devise a plan. Now, what's up with the instruction here to dress well and to wash? Throughout these messages, I sort of make those jokes that come out of the 90s rom-coms, but this story is about much more than romance. It's really not much about romance at all. It's far more about redemption. And what she's doing in this moment, I think, is that she's letting others know the period of grieving and mourning is over. Based on how she looks now, which would be common in Hebrew culture, she's saying, I am now available. So she goes to the threshing floor. And the threshing floor is a very interesting place for the next part of this story to play out. Let me show you a picture of what a threshing floor looked like. Kind of outside of town, there in the threshing floor, the chaff goes up, blows away, and the wind and the wheat would come down. This was the threshing floor, and this is where Ruth is about to go. And if you grew up in cultures that had this, you would think, what an interesting place for this redemption story to play out. And the reason for that is because of what happened at threshing floors. In fact, another Old Testament book, the book of Hosea, gives us a description of what was common on the threshing floor. Let me read to you what it was like there from Hosea chapter 9, verse 1. Do not rejoice, Israel. Do not be jubilant like the other nations, for you have been unfaithful to your God. You love the wages of a prostitute at every threshing floor. So that gives us some insight into what often happened on the threshing floor. The setting is harvest season. It's this time when men would leave their villages for weeks on end. They would camp by their piles of grain at the threshing floor, and there at night enjoy wine, woman, prostitution, song, and dance. It was wild, and this is where Ruth goes. An incredibly unlikely place for a redemption story to play out. No one would think that redemption would happen on the threshing floor. So this tension is really building. Now, it kind of is about to get a little bit weird for a moment, okay? Naomi tells her, uncover his feet, like do whatever he says, which parents in the room, you do not want to tell your teenage daughters this, right? Like do not say that to them. Do whatever he says, but this isn't a normal story. As we've seen in chapters 1 and 2, Ruth is a woman of courage. She's a foreigner. She's an immigrant in the land. She doesn't have much to give, but she has character, integrity, and courage. She's not like everybody else. And then there's Boaz, who also has shown an incredible amount of kindness and commitment. So although there's some interesting things that are about to unfold in Ruth chapter 3, we can understand them through Old Testament imagery, and it all starts to make a whole lot of sense. So she shows up on the threshing floor, and here's what happens, picking it up in verse 6. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, like a woman laying at your feet, that type of thing. Very startling, okay? He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Who are you, he asked. I'm your servant, Ruth, she said. They had already met. They had already exchanged incredible kindness. They had formed a friendship. And here's what she says. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family, a goel. okay? Guardian redeemer, we'll pause there. I've heard a lot of unique interpretations of this moment in the text. And honestly, they're a little bit cringy, okay? Here are the two things I usually hear. The text doesn't say they had sex, but wink, wink, they probably did. That's what we see here. You know, I've heard that one before. I've also heard the opposite, okay? This Hebrew way of saying, you know, cover me, it's a way of saying that they actually did have sex, and it turns into this romantic moment here. I don't think any of that's happening, actually. Here's what I think is actually going on. Ruth knows her need for redemption. She knows what she's been through. She knows what her family has been through. She knows she needs someone who can pay because she can't cover her, because she just never could. Redeem her life with worth and value. Show love to her and Naomi and the family and the deceased relatives in the family itself. She knows she needs redemption. And in this moment, her courage is on display. She walks into a place that just would be a place maybe unfit for someone like her. And she says this, what we just read, to Boaz. I think this is what she is saying in an Old Testament way, full of Old Testament imagery. She's saying this: I need your redemption. She knows she needs redemption. She knows that Boaz is capable and able to offer it. In this way, she is saying, would you redeem me? Would you cover me? I need your redemption. So when she says, cover me with your garments, it's her way of saying, let's tie the knot. It's a way of saying, would you please redeem me? She is well aware of her state, and she knows that he can do that. He can save her. He can redeem them. Now, the book of Ruth is so fascinating because it works on multiple levels. It works on the macro level and the micro level. On the micro level, we're seeing the redemption of one family. But on the macro level, we are seeing this play out, this massive story that was set up in the book of Judges that rolls into the book of Ruth. It's going to take us all the way to Jesus. I'll show you in just a moment. The book works on the macro level and the micro level as well. Let's wrap up at the micro, and then we'll turn and see how this connects the dots to our redemption today. Now, verse 10, the Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. I need your redemption. I think that statement right there is a contextual clue that she is asking for him to be their Redeemer. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it's true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there's another who is more closely related than I. This is interesting. That's where chapter 4 will go next week. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. Remember what happened on the threshing floor. If she was seen there, what would they say about her? So she goes away in a way that would be kind of covering up this moment, or she wouldn't be recognized. And he said, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. He also said, bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out. When she did, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town. So here again, we see the incredible kindness of Boaz on display. We see the noble character of Ruth on display as well in these details as she was leaving quietly. What I want us to connect the dots with is this: the threshing floor, it was not a place for redemption. It was a place of prostitution. It was an incredibly unlikely place for redemption to happen. It was a place of prostitution, not a place of redemption, but Boaz sent her away with a gift of kindness as evidence that if it was possible, he would be her kinsman redeemer. He would come through on that. The chapter wraps up with just 3 more verses, 16, 17, and 18. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, well, how'd it go, my daughter? Then she told her everything Boaz has done for her and added, he gave me these six measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. So we will pause there with a bit of a cliffhanger as we wait for the grand finale of the book of Ruth next week in chapter 4. Now, What do we do with all of this? How do we put it all together? Well, I've heard some interesting conclusions here. I've heard this chapter preached like this: ladies, if you're looking for your man, you got to go to where the godly men are. And I'm like, what? The threshing floor? I don't think so, This is not like a message on, how to get a date, okay? But I've heard it preached that way. I've heard it preached this way as well. Not all men are Boaz, so ladies, don't be like Ruth, okay? I've heard that one before as well. I've also heard it preached like this: ladies, just keep waiting. You're Boaz, well, he's a-coming, Like I've heard that one too, and I just don't think that does justice to this text, to this incredible chapter, and this incredible book, really, all about redemption. So what do we do with all of this? How do we put it all together? Well, more than this story whispering to us something about romance, this story is screaming out to us something about redemption. And what I want to do next is I want to drive us into the New Testament now, to Matthew, the first book of the New Testament, and help you see how all the dots are beautifully woven together to help us see on a macro level how God is redeeming the world. So we'll hang here in Ruth chapter 3. We'll pick it up in chapter 4 next week. But jumping over to Matthew chapter 1, we see the genealogy of Jesus set up like this. Well, there was Boaz. Spoiler alert, Boaz would actually then redeem in chapter 4. Still come back next week. Would redeem Ruth. His name is included here. Boaz was the father of Obed, his mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Ruth is the great-grandmother of King David, who would set up the Messiah. The book of Ruth shows us that God is at work in bringing a king to Israel in these unexpected ways. So here's the connection. Here's what we should really begin to be taking away from the book of Ruth. The redemption of Ruth through Boaz sets up the redemption of the world through Jesus. That's how we connect the overarching story of the Bible here and now. The redemption of Ruth through Boaz sets up the redemption of the whole world through Jesus. Remember what we've said about redemption. Redemption shows up every time we think to ourselves, I'm too blank to blank. We all need a redeemer. We need someone who can pay because we just never could. And in the book of Ephesians, a New Testament letter, Paul connects all the dots. He grew up studying the Old Testament. Surely the Apostle Paul would have known about the story of Ruth and these themes of redemption. He would have heard the genealogy that provided Jesus to the world. Then in Ephesians chapter 1, the Apostle Paul says this: in him, that's Jesus, we have redemption. We have redemption. The one who can pay because we just never could. The one who could take our place. The one who would exchange his life on our behalf. The one who would buy us back and buy us out of our sin. How did it happen? Redemption through his blood. That was the exchange. That was the payment that was necessary for our redemption. The forgiveness of sins in accordance with the riches of God's grace that he lavished on us. So not on the threshing floor now do we call out for redemption. We call out at the foot of the cross for our redemption. And this is the beautiful link, I think, between the gospel as communicated in the New Testament and the book of Ruth. So just as the threshing floor was an incredibly unlikely place for someone to pursue their redemption, so too the cross, as we understand it in the first century, it was a place of humiliation, and it too was an unlikely place for you and I to cry out for our redemption as well. The cross was a place of humiliation. It was not a place of redemption. But as we see the need for a payment for our sin, the cross became the place that Jesus paid on our behalf. So, I'm wondering if we can learn something from Ruth chapter 3. We learn that she took a courageous step to humble herself in a way that maybe wasn't comfortable for her, to say to Boaz, I need your redemption. Can you say to Jesus the same thing? Jesus, I need your redemption. And here's what that sounds like. Jesus, redeem me by paying for my sin because I can't pay for myself. That's what that sounds like. That simple prayer right there is a prayer of redemption. Can you say that? Have you prayed that? Have you said that? Or what's keeping you perhaps from saying that? But when we do, we acknowledge that we are too sinful to save ourselves. We are too broken to pay our payment. We just never could. But Jesus can. And when we come before him as our kinsman redeemer, he redeems us. Kinsman, redeemer, kinsman. Jesus was fully human. He knows what it's like to be you. He's also our redeemer, the one who paid for our life with his. He is our kinsman redeemer now, our Goel in Hebrew. And when we cry out to him, as Ruth cried out to Boaz, we can be sure that Jesus redeems us. It's so important we understand that. Now, at this point, when we start to talk about redemption, it is very easy for us to just cozy up to the warm theological concept of redemption and sort of play church. But I hope you will begin to see today your deep need in this life is for a redeemer. I recently heard a story about a woman who cried out to Jesus for redemption. She wrote an essay entitled, "Why I Consider Myself a Christian Now," why I call myself a Christian now. And I want to give you the backstory to this lady's life, because when you see the backstory and when you hear what I'm about to read to you, you will discover that she is not playing church. She is not cozying up to some warm theological ideas on a rainy Sunday in Utah. This is life-changing. On a macro level, civilizations are at stake with this. Eternity is at stake with redemption. Her name is Ayan Hirsi Ali. And she grew up in Kenya, and she converted to the Muslim Brotherhood in her late teenage years. Upon the threat of her life, forcefully she converted. And then for many years, she lived as a militant Muslim, and she would watch what she would call her people do to terrorize the world. She lived it firsthand. Perhaps we've watched it on the news. She lived it firsthand. And when she saw the horror, she eventually walked away from that. She became an atheist. She found the writings of Richard Dawkins and Bertrand Russell and Sam Harris incredibly compelling, often called the New Atheists. And this neo-atheism movement, which really is another form of religion, was something that captivated her, but only for a season. She's a political activist, she's an author, and so she would write about where she is now. And I want to read this to you. It's punchy, it's stern. The whole article is even punchier, but I didn't have time to walk into all of it. You can find it online. Here's what she says. Why do I call myself a Christian now? Why do I call myself a Christian now? And here's what she says. I would not be truthful if I attributed my embrace of Christianity solely to the realization that atheism is too weak and divisive a doctrine to fortify us against our menacing foes. What a sentence. If you read her article in context, when she's talking about menacing foes, she's talking about things that are a threat to civilization as we know it. She's talking about anti-Jesus global powers. She's talking about anti-Jesus religious movements. She is talking about anti-Jesus ideologies that are shaping our world, threatening our world. And our enemy is at work. He is a menacing foe at work behind these menacing foes in our world. She swung to atheism, but she realized that is not going to conquer or vanquish any of these foes. She goes on. I've also turned to Christianity because I ultimately found life without any spiritual solace unendurable. Indeed, very nearly self-destructive. Atheism failed to answer a simple question: what is the meaning and purpose of life? Russell and other activist atheists believed that with the rejection of God, we would enter into an age of reason and intelligent humanism. But the God hole, the void left by the retreat of the church, cannot retreat. But the void left by the retreat of the church has merely been filled by a jumble of irrational quasi-religious dogma. Quasi-religious dogma. Modern atheism is just another religious dogma. It's an approach to the origins of the world, the meaning of the world, the way morality should be in this world, and where things are headed. It is a story of reality that counters the story of reality that Jesus has authored. And in that, it is a quasi-religious dogma. The result is a world where modern cults prey on the dislocated masses with questions, with hurt, with pain, are wondering who will make sense of all of this and who will redeem us. And they are turning somewhere. They are turning to their Redeemer as they see it. Now, if that Redeemer is unable to redeem, they are left hopeless. And by the way, those people claiming to be the answer, they are just preying on those masses, harming them, hurting them, robbing them, offering them spurious reasons for being in action, mostly by engaging in virtue signaling theater. I will begin to steal that phrase from her. Virtue signaling theater. I will put on a show with how virtuous I am to signal to you all that I have it all together, that this is the way to live. She is calling that out, seeing right through it. That is not morality, and that will not redeem anybody. And then she says this: on behalf of a victimized minority or supposedly doomed planet. The line often attributed to G.K. Chesterton, famous theologian, has turned into a prophecy. When men choose not to believe in God, they do not thereafter believe in nothing. They then become capable of believing in anything. And in this nihilistic vacuum, the challenge before us becomes civilization. She talks about how if these anti-Jesus movements and menacing foes continue to expand, civilization as we know it will crumble. She is not playing games with redemption and cozying up to some theological ideas. She's not playing church. She's lived it all on both sides: extreme religious fanaticism, extreme atheism. She calls herself now a Christian. Let's keep reading. And fortunately, there is no need to look for some new age concoction of medication and mindfulness, something else that we don't know about that will solve all of this. She says there's no need to look. Look at this. Christianity has it all. That is why I no longer consider myself a Muslim apostate, but a lapsed atheist. I wonder if there's some lapsed atheists in the room today. Of course, I still have a great deal to learn about Christianity. I discover a little more at church each Sunday. I'm glad you're here today, discovering a little bit more each Sunday about church. She's doing the same. When you read this, I just hope you get the sense that we don't need to cozy up to redemption. We need to embrace it. We need to live this out. We are not playing church when we gather here. We are coming into contact with the God of the universe. We are bowing before him, the one who can redeem our lives. And then when we unite around our redemption, we play a part in God's redemptive story, offering a place for people to experience that redemption too. And one by one, as we join her wherever she is worshiping today, we are people who live out our redemption. And let me just tell you, our future on this planet and our future in eternity is at stake here and now. Our menacing foes of sin, Satan, death, and evil, they show up in a whole bunch of ways to rob from us our joy in our Jesus. But it's the redemption of Jesus that changes it all. So can you say what Ruth said? Can you say what Miss Ali has said? Can you say what so many around here have said? Jesus, I need your redemption. Please pay for me because I never could. You have already paid. Would you just apply it to my life? I want to pray for us now, and then we're going to celebrate the person who's done that. Let's pray. Jesus, I'm so grateful for the beautiful connections between the book of Ruth and the book of Matthew and the book of Ephesians, and how redemption is at the core of what you came to do, to redeem our lives when we just never could. Forgive us, Jesus, for the times that we cozy up to that theological idea, find ourselves tempted to just play church over again like we did last week and we might do next week. Help us see that your redemption is at the core of human flourishing. Help us be a place that unites around that redemption and invites other people to experience it as well. And for any of us who just haven't found our Redeemer yet, and perhaps we're searching for a Redeemer somewhere, may we turn to you here and now. And for the rest of our lives, may we continue to take our next step to understand how deep that redemption goes, how it changes everything globally, but internally and personally as well. Thank you for Ruth chapter 3, her courage, her boldness to know her need for redemption and to cry out for it. Here we are, Jesus, doing just the same. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's message and trusting us with your time. If you'd like to connect with one of our pastors or staff, you can easily do that by visiting smccutah.org/connect. When you fill out that quick form, they will get back to you within a few days and be able to connect with you. As well, if you'd like to know more about taking a next step at SMCC, you can easily look at what next steps we have by visiting smccutah.org/nextsteps. And lastly, if you found today's message both hopeful and helpful, I would encourage you to do maybe one of two things. First, you can share this message with someone that would find it helpful. And you can also choose to partner with us financially so that more people can see messages like this. You can find more information on what that looks like by visiting smccutah.org/give. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you at one of our locations soon.